1700, 1865, Rococo to Realism. Okay, so we are going to be entering a period of tremendous social, economic, and political upheaval. We're going to see a transition in this century of the power from wealthy to the middle class. We are going to see the Industrial Revolution. We're going to see a huge sort of intellectual movement called the Enlightenment. And overall, what we're going to see is tremendous change. We're going to see political change. We're going to see sort of the rise of sort of modern political thought with the advent of modern democracy and the American Revolution in 1776. We're going to see subsequently then the slow sort of breakdown of monarchies all across Europe and really the rest of the world. We're also going to see tremendous change in terms of technology. We're going to see the invention of the steam engine. We're going to see sort of advances in physics and engineering that are going to lead to a series of tremendous changes known as the Industrial Revolution. So this is a period of tremendous and deep change. So let's start with the early part of the 1700s and a period in art that emerges out of France called the Rococo. The Rococo is in many ways an offshoot and a continuation of the big art movement of the 17th century, the Baroque. In fact, the term Rococo is a play on the word Baroque, Barococo. You can sort of hear the root word in there. So what happens is this. Louis the XIV of France, the Sun King, you remember this guy, l'état c'est moi, I am the state, dies. And remember, he had moved most of the bulk of his court out to Versailles so he could maintain complete control. Well, after his death, many members of the court moved back to France. So these wealthy, aristocratic French courtiers moved back to Paris, I should say, not France, they're already in France, moved back to Paris, and they start to build these large urban palaces known as hotels. So this is where we get our modern word hotel, but the term hotel use at this time has a slightly different meaning. Think of these large mansions with multiple rooms, that were kind of like, urban palaces. They weren't places where you could rent rooms nightly, but certainly visitors would come and stay. These houses were meant for hosting huge events and gatherings and things like that. In fact, one of the kinds of gatherings that we're going to see really become a central part of Parisian life are what are called hotels. What are called salons that occur in these hotels. Salons, think of them as sort of like dinner parties or cocktail parties, where the sort of upper classes, the elite sort of citizens of Paris and really France would come and meet and hang out and talk. These were places where you were meant to be seen. The style of the Rococo is very extravagant. It's sort of some of its major traits are that it's whimsical, it's sort of frivolous. The clothing of this period is very, very over the top. There's sort of a emphasis on sort of really nice materials, silks and velvets and things like that. The clothes were meant to show off one's wealth if you were part of the sort of upper crust. Of course, you've seen like the large powdered wigs that people would wear. High heels were also very much in fashion, although it had shifted from men's fashion in the 1600s to women's fashion in the 1700s. High heels had. The colors tended to be very bright and bold, but also very soft colors like pastels, pinks and blues and pale greens and things like that. But everything is meant to kind of show off one's wealth and one's taste. But think of these salons as more than just sort of a place where you go to be seen, although that's a big part of it. It was a place where you could also hear the latest gossip, but also the latest news, and more importantly, sort of exchange the latest ideas. And many of the people who would show up at these salons weren't just sort of members of the upper crust, but they're also we're looking at some of the brightest thinkers of the day. Philosophers and university professors and inventors would come. And sort of at the center of all of this activity at these salons are what are known as the femmes savantes. Femmes savantes, it literally means learned women or educated women. And these were sort of the powerful, elite, aristocratic women who would host these salons, who were sort of the heads of these, the matriarchs of these powerful French aristocratic families. For example, Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France. But there were a whole other host of these women, and many of these women were highly educated themselves. You know, the French aristocratic women at this time were expected to be not only educated but knowledgeable about world events. They were also expected to be very cultured, so many of these women knew how to play instruments, many of them multiple instruments. They were trained in singing often from a young age. They often were also trained in other artistic pursuits like painting and drawing and things like that. Not as a career choice, but as a way of sort of enriching their lives. But these women were often incredibly educated and well informed. And they were often responsible for inviting some of these big thinkers. And this is going to have a huge effect later on this big movement we call the Enlightenment. So what you got a little bit of the taste of the clothing. So I think you can understand what the style is of the Rococo. It's very much an offshoot of the Baroque. And if we look at this image, this is the Salon de la Princesse. This is a salon room in one of the hotels of one of these French femmes savantes. And you can see here, it's very over the top in its decoration. It's very ornate, very much in continuation of the Baroque. But I would say even more ornate, and also a little frillier. You know, I think the best way to sort of differentiate between the Baroque and the Rococo are the colors. The colors of the Rococo tend to be lighter, but just in general, it's a sort of a frillier, happier, sweeter, cuter kind of version. I sort of see it as like the Baroque is kind of the more serious, kind of grumpy version, often violent, often intense, whereas the Rococo is sort of sweet and funny and a little cute even. But also an element of the Rococo is that the style of decoration and design is all integrated. If you look at this room of the Salon de la Princesse, you'll see that the sculpture and the painting and the decorative elements are all integrated. They're not separated. The paintings aren't like framed and hung on the wall next to a sculpture that's sitting sort of away from it on a pedestal, but instead it's like the entire room is a work of art. And you can imagine what these salons were like, with these men and women in their extravagant outfits sort of parading around in these over-the-top, luxurious, decorative kinds of rooms. The whole, it's like the entire culture is about sort of an aesthetic kind of presentation, isn't it? Right? Okay, and here's just a close-up so you can see just the incredible detail. If you wanted to sort of narrow down the Rococo to one painting, this is a good place to start, I think. This is a work by Jean-Honoré Fragonard, and it is called The Swing. And it is a rather humorous piece, like a lot of Rococo is. A lot of Rococo art is very funny, it's very kind of frivolous, but also I think it has some insight in its frivolity and its silliness and its humor. This is an image of a wealthy, sort of noble woman. It very much could be a femme savant. And here she is on her swing. And look at this extravagant backyard. This is basically her property. And it's this beautiful, over-the-top sort of French garden with this classical-looking sculpture. And in the background, we see her neighbor, this kindly old man, as he swings this young, sweet, noble woman on a swing. And it's all meant to be very sort of family-friendly and very quaint and very cute. This young, beautiful woman and this old, kindly old man. But if you look on the other side, on the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that there's a young gentleman sort of hiding in her bushes. And he is looking up as she swings. And, of course, the old man, the kindly old neighbor, is completely oblivious that this young man is here. And this man is, well, he's seeing a lot more than the swing as she swings over him as he peers through her shrubbery. And she knows he's there. In fact, she has playfully kicked off her shoe, and it's flying through the air and going to land on his head. She's acknowledging that he's there, and she's in a way sort of playing with him like, yeah, I will be seeing you later after the old man leaves here, and will, well, do whatever young men and women do in their spare time. I'm sure they were going to play a nice game of Monopoly or something like that. So you can see that there's a playfulness here, there's a sensuality and a sexuality here. I also like the woman is shown with a kind of agency. You know, French women, especially at this time of the upper classes, if not holding a lot of power sort of legally and politically and sort of on paper, they did exert a lot of control, or at least influence, let's say that's a better word, in French society. And I think this shows very much that sort of position of this woman. This is a Rococo painting by the artist Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who's one of the great artists of the Rococo. She was trained by her father, as many of these women painters were, as you know. This is of her friend, the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. And of course, you probably know a little bit about Marie Antoinette, very famously, said, "Let them eat cake." Sorry, I heard a sound outside my window. During the French Revolution, and was beheaded. There was very much a feeling among the French population that the monarchy had sort of lost touch with the needs of the people, and some would argue that their rule was downright disastrous, and that many people suffered and were living in poverty because of the greed of the upper classes. And this will eventually, at the end of the century, lead to revolution. And so what we see here is kind of an image that is meant to play down the kind of frivolity often associated with the Rococo. This is a very late Rococo work. And in this, Marie Antoinette, who is really sort of known as this, kind of party girl who was, known for taking on many sort of lovers and having all sorts of affairs, on the side. And it's meant to show her as a very serious sort of mother kind of figure. And in fact, it's meant to evoke sympathy. We see a bassinet with a black curtain that has been pulled back, and of course curtains being pulled back reveal the truth, and the truth is that Marie Antoinette had a child who had died, and I can't remember if the child died in childbirth or shortly thereafter, but it's meant to sort of evoke sympathy. And Norton is telling me things are safe, so that's good. It is meant to evoke sympathy, and it's meant to evoke also this idea that this is a woman who is a good mother. And it is meant to show a very different side of her as as sort of the French population is becoming more and more and more dissatisfied with the French monarchy. This is a little bit of propaganda. The French Rococo also influenced art outside of sort of French noble life, and we can see that in the architecture of churches. This is a church from Germany by a guy named Balthasar Neumann. It is a pilgrimage church. It is a church very much in the Rococo style. It is light, it is airy, it is very sort of frilly and over the top in its decoration. There are a series of, I think, 14 statues at the end here, who are all, that it was believed that if you pray to them, they could cure illness. This is very common, as you know, for pilgrimage churches, the idea that there's sort of healing properties to relics or statues and things like that. But you can see that this sort of kind of floofy sort of Rococo style could be found outside of the hotels and the palaces of the French aristocracy. Here's just another version of it. Okay. So now I want you guys to watch a video on the Enlightenment. There's a video down below, so take a look at that and then come on back. All right, so as you guys learn, the Enlightenment is this intellectual movement that emphasizes rationality. It emphasizes reason above everything else. And it's sort of rooted in the late 1600s and Isaac Newton's sort of discovery of gravity, his discovery of the movement of the planets, and his invention of calculus, to name a few of the many, many things he did. But what Newton basically sort of proves is that the world can be understood through reason and rationality. By researching and using logic, one could understand the very sort of mechanics of the universe. So there is very much this belief that if we approach the world with this kind of reason, we could make it a better place, not just sort of in the realm of science and technology and engineering, but also in the way we construct our societies. And so there starts to come in the Enlightenment this idea that we need to make better societies, and that in some cases Enlightenment thinkers are thinking that the aristocracy is broken, and our sort of dependence on kings and monarchs is not working. And this idea that somebody could claim divine right, that God has chosen them to rule over a bunch of people, might actually be sort of absurd. And so one of the results of the Enlightenment is now there's a more interest in sort of the common people as opposed to the aristocracy. And so we start to see paintings like this one by JeanBaptiste Valley, which is a painting of sort of a peasant family, not a peasant family, but sort of a lower middle class family, a marriage that is meant to show that these are sort of good, working class, salt of the earth kind of people. And there's sort of an emphasis on this concept of sort of hard work, on morality, on this idea that maybe in some ways the working classes and the middle classes are more ethical and more moral than those of the upper classes. And there's also this idea that happiness is the reward of natural virtue, that if one is intrinsically good and moral, then that will lead to happiness, not wealth and not power, not sort of the desires of the upper classes. And this is often contrasted with images like this by William Hogarth in this painting called The Marriage Settlement, which is part of a much larger series called Marriage a la Mode, which is meant to show sort of the ambitions of the upper classes and the moral failings of the upper classes. We're looking at an arranged marriage. And if you contrast this with Grose's piece, which has this very sort of sentimental quality, these sort of working class people and their sort of acceptance of each other and the combining of this family coming together, this very sort of traditional kind of way. Here we're seeing a marriage that is an arranged marriage, a marriage that is meant to sort of combine family fortunes and meant to enrichen the members of each family. One of the families has a title but is poor. The other family is wealthy but has no title. They aren't a noble family, and so the marriage of these two families together will increase both of their fortunes and their positions in society. And so you can see the two fathers, the patriarchs of the family over here, basically handling all the business, while the husband and wife literally kind of ignore each other. And the wife is over here sort of flirting with her lawyer, while the husband is sort of completely bored and ignoring everything and playing with a snuff box, which is meant to show sort of maybe his kind of loose morals as well as his brides-to-be. And this is sort of reflected in the behavior of the dogs, who are sort of completely bored by the whole thing. This was a series of several parts, with each painting sort of reflecting the decline of this marriage. In the second painting, we see the couple is now married, but the wife is and husband aren't getting along. He's exhausted and worn out. He's been out gambling. She's been maybe spending a little too much time with her friend the lawyer, but look at their house. It is in disarray. It is slovenly. This is a meant to sort of show the lack of kind of moral integrity of these people. As the series goes on, we eventually see that the wife has now consummated an affair, or has begun an affair with the lawyer, and we can see that he is now fleeing outside the window as the husband bursts into her bedroom and catches the two lovers together, and then the lawyer has now stabbed the husband. It ends with the wife committing suicide. And if you look at the home here, you can see it's in complete disarray. The cute little puppy dogs at the beginning now are emaciated and their ribs are showing, and he's eating a pig's head that is on the table. Their house is in complete disarray, and she, in this sort of moment of regret and remorse for what she has done, is now committed suicide. You'll notice this is a print. This was an engraving. Hogarth typically made engravings of his paintings because they were very, very popular, and this way you could also sell these for so individuals could have copies of these in their homes and collect these prints. So you could own the entire series, because while a painting would have been incredibly expensive and rare to possess, your middle class English families could afford these kinds of prints. But these were very much a critique on the the upper classes. In France, in England, really throughout much of Europe at this time, there is very much a change sort of in the way the upper classes are being perceived, and that there's this idea that they are decadent and they are corrupt and they are greedy and they are immoral. Okay. So, art academies. We can't really talk about the art of this period, or really the next century, especially, without talking about art academies. The Art Academy of France was begun in the 1600s under Louis XIV. And art academies were basically government organizations that monitored and in some ways controlled the production of art. And every year in France, the Academy of Painting would hold what was called the Grand Salon. And it was initially held at Versailles, but later on it moved to the Louvre. And as you can see, it was this huge art show. And if you were a working artist in France and you wanted people to see your work, you submitted your paintings of that year to the Grand Salon. Pardon me, with the hope that they would be accepted. Now, there was a kind of hierarchy of paintings. A hierarchy of subject matter, because the salon and the academy was very selective, and to get your work accepted, you had to paint in a certain style. There were only acceptable styles that were allowed in, and there was only certain subject matter that was accepted. And so there's this kind of hierarchy of subject matter. You could see that, for example, history paintings, and this includes biblical scenes, mythological scenes, and historical scenes, were at the top. These were generally large and grand, massive paintings. Think of these as kind of the big blockbuster movies of their day. And then underneath, you had paintings of different categories. You had portraits. You had something called genre painting. Genre painting is a painting of everyday life. The marriage paintings we just saw are examples of genre paintings. Landscapes, still lifes, paintings of animals. So there was this, and so if you painted history paintings, you were one of the big deals. If you painted portraits, you maybe weren't quite as important of an artist, but you had to paint subjects that could fit in one of those categories. And what you'll see is that this could be very limiting. This meant that artists couldn't, they had to stick to certain subjects, they had to stick to certain styles, and it was really difficult to be innovative during this period. But it really could make or break you as an artist. After the French Revolution in 1789, the art academies we're going to see that their influence and their power are going to, start to wane over the next century and throughout the 1800s. But certainly it is, the art academies had a tremendous influence. So one of the things you saw in the video about the Enlightenment was the sort of influence of science and reason and rational thought. We had, as I mentioned, Isaac Newton, and this idea that you need empirical proof. You have to show facts, right? You have to, your work has to be logical, it has to be rational, and it has to be based in observation and fact. Then we also see sort of the rise of these thinkers, philosophers, like the Englishman John Locke, who comes up with this doctrine of empiricism, that knowledge comes from sensory perception. But he also says that humans are basically good, but it's society that corrupts us. He also said that there are certain laws of nature that grant every human, not just kings or rulers or the aristocracy, but every human being. And we are all given these gifts by God, the right to life, liberty, and he said property. Later on in the United States, we will change that property to the pursuit of happiness. But you can see here how the Enlightenment is going to really influence the revolutions that will come later in the 1700s. In France, there were a group of thinkers called the philosophes, who believed that, they all had sort of slightly different ideas, but there was this idea that we should better ourselves. There was this doctrine of progress, that we should all strive for what's better in our lives, and that this is so we can become better and more moral people, and that we can be perfected, that we can sort of attain a kind of best version of ourselves. And then I'll leave some of this other stuff up to you, because this is all covered in that other video. Okay. So the art of the Enlightenment reflects this interest in science and empiricism. And to me, this is a painting that is really illustrates this fact. This is by an English artist named Joseph Wright of Derby. I know it looks like Derby, it's pronounced Derby. And Joseph Wright here has painted very much in the style of the Baroque artist Caravaggio with his dramatic tenebrism. But whereas Caravaggio used his light to represent the light of God, here Derby is Joseph Wright, I should say, of Derby is using light to reflect the light of reason and science and knowledge. This is an orrery. An orrery is a model of the solar system. It's like a clockwork machine that you kind of wind up and the planets spin around. And this was sort of based on the principles that were discovered by Isaac Newton. But the idea here is that, once again, the world can be observed through empiricism, through observing it and recording data, and we can understand things that way. Not through superstition, not through even faith, really, but through observation. So the Enlightenment inspires a style of art we call Neoclassicism. Classicism, or classical art, or classical culture in general, refers to Greece and Rome. And Greece and Rome are going to have a huge influence in the Enlightenment, because many of the political concepts that we have now absorbed into our modern systems of government were derived from Greece and Rome, like Greek democracy. And of course, democracy is a Greek term meaning rule by the people, and Roman republicanism, which is a representative form of government where senators are elected to represent their constituents. And, these are humanist ideas, right? Neoclassicism and the Enlightenment in general is very humanist because it believes that human reason, human rationality, human thought, human observation, human empiricism is the sort of, will lead us to the path of enlightenment. So, along with this interest in science and reason and all this stuff, there's also an interest in classical Greek and Roman ideas and art and culture, because those cultures are seen as sort of the exemplars of moral and rational, and reasonable thought, stability and balance and order. Okay, so this is a painting by another woman artist, Anne Vallier Caspar. This was, she was, like many women artists, trained by her father. She used this piece to get into the French Academy of Painting, which did allow some women. There was a limit of how many they allowed every year. Although after the French Revolution, that will change and women will be barred again from entering the Academy. This is a great example of neoclassical art. First of all, there's neoclassical subjects, these sort of Greek-style busts and statues here. But also there's an interest on reason and logic and learning and science and discovery. Along with her artistic tools, there are tools related to mathematics and geometry, which of course could also be used in making art. But this is also very orderly in the way it's arranged. Every object sort of stands on its own, very easy to read, separate from the other objects. Next to it, everything is laid out in a very orderly, rational kind of way, and this is something we're going to see a lot in neoclassical art. We're not going to see a lot of great emotion or intensity or passion or things like that, but everything's going to be very intellectual. In fact, everything in this painting is really about sort of intellectual pursuits. It's about an intellectual approach to art. It's about reason and measure, literally measuring, being a, measured carrying things out in a measured, rational sort of way, following the rules, right? So, this is a work by the great neoclassical artist Jacques-Louis David. It's called The Oath of the Horatii, and it is a painting that is based on an event from Roman history that was actually made into a play by a playwright named Pierre Cornelia, pardon me, and it was based on the Roman historian Livy. It is the story of a family called the Horatius family, or the Horatii, who have been chosen by their country of Rome to fight against the city of Alba and to fight a family called the Curatius family, or the Curati family. And the idea here is that this is meant to illustrate something called the social contract. The social contract was espoused by several Enlightenment thinkers. And basically the social contract is about how, as citizens of a country or a society, we have an obligation to our fellow citizens. And it's sort of the whole united we stand, divided we fall, right? And the idea is that we must always be putting ourselves in service of the greater good. That is the social contract. And so, you know, the basic idea is that governments exist for the betterment of their people, right? And governments wouldn't exist if it weren't for us, and we wouldn't have sort of the raw materials to build a good society without our governments. So, for example, a government provides things we need to be prosperous. They give us roads and infrastructure. They provide police and military to protect us. They provide schools to educate us. And we, in turn, provide, well, we pay taxes, right? We follow those laws. So, you know, the idea, it's sort of give and take. To get something, you have to give back. But also vice versa. The government has to sort of promise to be not corrupt. They have to promise to have sort of the best interest of the people at heart. And if the government does become corrupt, then the social contract is broken. And we have a right to elect new leaders or, you know, take control of the government back. But, you know, the military service really plays into this, for instance, right? If your country is threatened, then you have a moral obligation to the other people in your society that if your government calls and asks you to fight, just like Rome asked the Horatii brothers to fight, then you take up arms and you fight. And if you don't do this, then the whole social contract is broken and society falls apart. So if the government becomes corrupt, things fall apart. If the citizens don't do their share, then things fall apart. It is basically saying that the individual is less important than the whole, is what the social contract is about. And so these three men, these three brothers, are swearing an oath that they will fight for their country. But David is saying that sometimes that sacrifice we have to make for the greater good is the ultimate sacrifice. It is our lives. But also that sacrifice can affect other people. Because what you now know is that the brothers that the Horatii are fighting, the Curati brothers, the youngest Horatii brother is married to a Curati sister. And one of the Horatii sisters was engaged to a Curati brother. So there is familial connections between the two families. And so one of the brothers is going to lose a wife, and one of the women is going to lose a fiancé. And David is saying that sucks, but that's what the social contract is about, that we must put the needs of the many in front of our own personal needs, if it is required by the state, if it is required by society at large. Because if we are selfish, then the social contract is broken and society falls apart and nobody benefits. Heavy stuff, right? It's a long way from a girl on a swing kicking your shoe at a guy hiding in the shrubbery down below, isn't it? And if you look at the painting, it's very serious in its design and its layout. It's very stripped down. It's very simple. We have this very almost black and white sort of background with these very severe Roman arches and Greek Doric columns. And look how the figures are lined up front in a very easy to read manner. You don't even have to know this story to be able to read it pretty quickly. 3 men are swearing an oath to fight, and these women are sad about it. It's all right there in front of you. It's very clear, it's very concise, it's very rational and reasonable in the way it is presented. Because like most neoclassical art, there is a moral message being delivered here. And so that moral message has to be clear. It cannot be vague. It cannot be clouded. This is a work by Angelica Kaufmann, who was a Swiss artist working in England, who was also allowed into the British Royal Academy of Art. This is an image from also Roman history about a woman named Cornelia who is approached by this wealthy noblewoman who asks Cornelia, well, let me see your jewels. Here are my jewels. And she pulls out this sort of beautiful necklace. And Cornelia looks at the lady and says, well, here are my jewels. And she points to her children. So this plays into this Enlightenment idea that that we sort of saw before, that, family is important, and there's something noble about, sort of caring for one's family and raising good, responsible citizens as children. But also here there's obviously a rejection against greed and a rejection against sort of the desires of the, sort of upper and wealthy classes here. Okay. Let me move my little picture over here. So neoclassical is also a style that influences architecture, and I could show you many examples, but we're going to look at an American example by Thomas Jefferson. This is his home, Monticello. But Thomas Jefferson designed many buildings. He was an architect not of just this country, but an actual architect who designed buildings and also contributed to the overall look of Washington, D.C. And when our founding fathers of this country started designing the buildings of this young nation, they looked to ancient Greece and Rome for inspiration, with the idea being that if the ideas of this country are Greek and Roman in origin, literally, democracy is a Greek word, then the buildings that reflect those principles should be Greek and Roman in their design. And so this Monticello is very much based on the work of Palladio, the Venetian architect, and his Villa Rotunda. And of course, as you guys know by now, that building is based on the Roman Pantheon. And you can see very clearly the use of a Greek pediment, of Greek-style Doric columns, of a Roman-style arch and rotunda, that this is very classical in its design. Also notice there's hardly any ornamentation. Everything is simple and stripped down and reasonable and rational. And of course, reasonable and rational are sort of the buzzwords for moral in the Enlightenment. There's a rejection of extravagance here. This architecture is not just designed for design's sakes, but it's meant to reflect the sort of moral and intellectual ideas and the moral intellectual nature of Enlightenment principles. So, along with the Enlightenment comes a reevaluation of the practice of slavery. Because the idea is that if we all have these sort of inalienable rights, if as human beings every person is given the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, we're all guaranteed those things, then slavery is a slap in the face against that. And while this is something that we fought against in America, and it really took until the Civil War before slavery is abolished, many European countries start to abolish slavery much earlier than in the United States. And we see this illustrated in the work here by William Blake, an English artist and a poet, who was very much a supporter of the abolition of the slave trade. But this is an image that is meant to show sort of the cruel treatment of African people under the transatlantic slave trade. And images like this were rather prevalent in the Enlightenment as a means to sort of show the horrors of the slave trade. But also, this is not just an Enlightenment image. This is an image that is part of a movement we call Romanticism. And Romanticism is a movement that starts to really take off in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and in as many ways a reaction against Enlightenment. Where the Enlightenment influences reason and rationality, Romanticism champions emotion and feeling over sort of reason and rational thought. Sort of passion is a real important part of Romanticism. But before I get too deeply into Romanticism, let's take one other look at an image of that relates to abolition of slavery. This is by the French artist Henri de Tresson. It is JeanBaptiste Valley, who was a Senegal native. He was a former slave from the West Indies who bought his own freedom and fought against his colonialist oppressors and was wounded 6 times. But eventually he was elected to the French National Convention, where he fought for the abolition of slavery, and in 1794 in France, slavery was abolished. And so here we see this man who was a former slave who has now sort of reached this height of a sort of influential French politician, and he is standing in front of a bust of a man named Guillaume Thomas, who was a philosopher who very much wrote about the abolishment of slavery and was very much an anti-slavery writer and thinker. So, all of these ideas are coming out of the Enlightenment, with this idea that slavery is an unreasonable and irrational and immoral act. So Romanticism. I'm going to have you guys watch another video down below about something called the Sublime. And then watch that and then come on back. Alright, welcome back. So Romanticism is a movement based in this idea of the sublime. It dominates the first half of the 19th century. There's an emphasis on individuality and emotion. In art, we see a lot of emotion, movement, and drama. There's also, as you saw in the video on the sublime, an interest in nature, and especially the power of nature. And a lot of this also comes directly from the rejection of industrialization. One of the things that the Enlightenment brought was these sort of huge changes in science and engineering that led to the Industrial Revolution and led to mass production and the sort of creation of factories all over Europe and the Americas and really throughout the world. And what we are starting to see is, in many places, there is a sense of horror as the countrysides are being developed and enveloped by industry and growth. There is a real feeling that nature is being lost by this new technological movement and this industrial revolution. And so one of the main ideas in Romanticism is that nature is better, that nature is nature is and that there needs to be sort of we need to fight against this technological revolution. Also, as you guys know now, there's a very close association with the sublime in nature, that the power of nature is awesome. It is both sort of horrifying and frightening, and kind of puts us in our place, makes us feel significant, but at the same time, that makes us better people. It makes us more moral because we can sort of see the sort of bigger picture and this place where we fit in, which we're just this tiny part of this sort of overall universe. But during this period, we start to see Romanticism not just in art, but also in classical music. The music of this period, the classical music of this period, becomes very dramatic, very emotional. Think of, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but artists like Schubert and Liszt and Chopin and Brahms. We also think of literature like Keats and Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, and Shelley, both Shelleys. Percy and Mary, and in many ways, like if you want to sort of think like the definitive romantic novel is Frankenstein, because Frankenstein is very much about the sublime. It's about man sort of trying to, through these kind of Enlightenment, reason and rationality and technology, tries to usurp nature, tries to undo nature, and tries to conquer death. And if the hero of the novel, Dr. Frankenstein, does this by digging up bodies and sort of messing with these kinds of elemental forces of nature, literally life and death itself, and it blows up in his face. He can't control it, and it literally his creation literally turns into a monster, this sort of horrific abomination of life itself, and destroys everyone at the end. The idea is like if you play with fire, you're going to get burned, right? And nature is this awesome, powerful thing that eventually, if you mess with it, it's going to come back to you. So a lot of themes of nature and the destruction of nature by Enlightenment technologies are a big part of the novel of Frankenstein. So I hope you guys are getting the idea by now that Romanticism doesn't mean just love, right? And romance in the way we think of it as sort of romantic love, although certainly that could be part of it. But Romanticism is about passion, it is about motion, it is about sort of big, grand kinds of stories and large-scale paintings very often. But sometimes Romanticism can be very dark. It sort of deals with extremes, so it can kind of deal with sort of great loves and heroic deeds, but it also could deal with sort of the more gruesome and horrific side of life. Francisco Goya is a Spanish artist. He is the court artist of the King of Spain, but he is one of the leading artists of the Romantic movement. His art is very much influenced by the sort of violence that man could exhibit against his fellow man. Goya lived through a French occupation of his home country of Spain, and this was actually, the irony is that France was invited by Spain to help overthrow the Spanish king and to put another monarch in place, but the French ended up not leaving, and they ended up doing horrific things to the peasantry of Spain. And there was an uprising in May of 1808 against the French soldiers, and the French soldiers quickly quashed this and executed many of the Spanish in firing squads like this one. So you can see here that Goya is using sort of dark, brooding colors. He's using sort of this deep black sky to sort of emphasize this sort of ominous nature of this violence. And he's being completely unapologetic in the way he's portrayed the violence here, with these bodies sort of stacked on top of each other in this pool of blood. Also, look at the way he's painted in this very sort of almost sketchy kind of style, as if the intensity of this moment is so much that he can't paint with these sort of beautiful, refined kind of brushstrokes, but it's done in this almost cartoonishly sketchy sort of format to show this sort of horrific scene. Then, of course, you know, if to me one of the exemplars of Romantic art is, pardon me guys for yawning, is the Raft of the Medusa, an image that deals with extremes, that deals with this sort of extreme situation of these men fighting for their lives on this raft and resorting to sort of the darkest of recourses in the form of cannibalism to survive. It also deals with the sublime nature of the ocean, and you could imagine these men being stranded out here. And of course, you all know this story because we looked at this painting early on this semester. But this, to me, exhibits the qualities of what Romantic art is about. These sort of extremes, this extreme darkness and violence and the power, the sublime power of nature, but also heroicism, right? And the celebration of the individual, with that man standing up at the top, waving his flag or his torn garment, whatever it is, waiting for rescue. So this is a very romanticized view of this event, with sort of both extremes sort of being brought to the forefront here. This is a work by an artist, Eugène Delacroix, who was a student and friend of Theodore Géricault, who painted Raft of the Medusa. And this is an image depicting the revolution in France of 1830. And here we see sort of this was a real event, but it's portrayed in this very romanticized sort of way. First of all, we had this image of liberty, this personification. Personification, what does that mean? When you take an idea, a concept, like the idea of liberty, and you turn it into a person, personification. And here we see liberty as this almost maternal figure with her breast bared, leading the citizens of Paris in this revolutionary moment. So it's real events, but depicted in this very romanticized sort of way, with an emphasis on heroism, with an emphasis on also violence. And you know, Romanticism is about these big sort of subjects that are often beyond our own control, whether it's nature and the sublime quality of nature, or things like warfare are often very commonly depicted in Romantic art. This is not in your book, but I want to take a look at this because this is by a German artist, Caspar David Friedrich. So Caspar David Friedrich often painted images of people sort of dwarfed by the power of nature. He would often show people from the back, sort of anonymous and dwarfed and overtaken by these incredible landscapes, often wild and untamed views of the sea or mountain ranges or cliff sides, sort of various grand landscapes unfurling in front of the viewer as they are completely blown away by the sublime nature of nature. So I just wanted to show you some Caspar David Friedrich because I'm a fan, and I think that this reflects in many ways the central themes of Romanticism. Joseph Mallord William Turner, JMW Turner, is an English artist who I think, a lot of the Romantic artists painted in this sort of wild style, and none more than Turner. His style is so sort of unhinged and unrefined that it's almost abstract. The way he applies his paint is so sort of is with so much sort of passion and emotion that the image itself almost becomes difficult to decipher. I'm going to move my my little... Hi, I'm over here on the other side now. This is a painting of an event that occurred in the previous century that Turner read about in a book sort of about the horrors of the slave trade. And this is an image of about a captain who threw over 50 slaves who were sick because of the insurance policy that he had taken on his quote-unquote cargo, was that it was better for them to be lost at sea because he would be compensated than if they had died from sickness and he would not have been compensated. So, after you look past sort of the initial sort of burst of color that Turner has painted, these sort of swirling, incredible applications of paint. If you look closely, you realize you're looking at a scene of a ship at sea, and if you look closely, you can see chains and you can see hands of the slaves emerging from the water before they drown. And this scene is horrific. It is sublime in its horror, and in the horror that it shows that man is capable of perpetrating. It is horrific in the horror in it is sublime in its depiction of the inhumanity that man can bestow on his fellow human beings. But the way he paints this image, I think, is incredibly moving. Notice how the colors he's using. That sunset is almost like a fire. It's almost hellish, as if this act itself is hell on earth. The evil that we are seeing here, that is being performed against these poor people, these slaves who have been captured and imprisoned and now been callously thrown overboard, can be described with no other words than evil. And the almost flame-like way Turner has painted this sky, I think, reflects the kind of demonic quality that he was trying to convey. In America, we also see an interest in Romanticism and an interest in the land itself. This is an English artist named Thomas Cole who was working in the United States, and he ended up founding a sort of school of painters, a group of painters who called themselves the Hudson River School. And they mostly worked in the New York area painting the Hudson River Valley, and a lot of their concerns in their painting was ecological. They wanted to preserve in painting the landscape, which was quickly vanishing and being developed by industry and by cities and towns being developed along the Hudson River. And for them, nature, of course, is something that is beautiful and sublime, and they wanted to preserve that and capture that. And they often painted these large sort of vistas with these beautiful landscapes, sort of trying to kind of capture the purity of the natural environment. Once again, a major concern of the Romantic movement. And that's it, guys. That's it for Romanticism. I will see you in the next chapter. Bye.